Hey guys, tonight we slip beneath the shifting sands of Egypt, back to around 3032 BCE, when the desert air hums with whispers of gods and kings, and the Nile swells under the sun's unblinking eye. You're standing at the edge of Thebes, the sacred heart of old Egypt, where the smell of incense seeps from temple courtyards, and the chatter of priests bounces between stone colonnades. Just across the river, burial cliffs glow red at sunset, their hidden tombs promising eternity for the fortunate few. The city is restless, half in awe and half in fear, because the crown has landed on the head of a child. Tutankhaten, barely 9 years old, handed the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt in a world still shaking from the religious earthquake of his father's reign. You probably won't survive this one if you are actually standing there. Palace politics, scheming generals and moody gods don't exactly make room for curious tourists. Before we dive into his world, a quick word. Tonight's story is Tutankhamun, the boy king who defied death. If you're enjoying these late-night trips through history, don't forget to tap that subscribe button, drop a like, and share this with someone who still thinks mummies are just Halloween costumes. And since we're talking about Egypt's boy pharaoh, tell me, where in the world are you listening from? And what time is it on your clock right now? Post it in the comments, because I bet Tutankhamun never had to deal with time zones. Alright then, let's sink back into the cushions, dim the lights, and let the story of the boy king flow over you like the slow roll of the Nile. Sweet dreams might not come easy tonight, but history will. The years still roar with the aftershocks of Akhenaten's bizarre experiment. His father, the heretic king, had dared to defy 1,000 years of tradition by throwing Egypt's many gods into the shadows and lifting one, the sun disk, Aten, into exclusive worship. Imagine a religious monopoly overnight. Temples closed, statues smashed, priests of Amun and others stripped of their incomes and their honor. People weren't exactly lining up to cheer. And then, as suddenly as it began, the revolution crumbled. Akhenaten died, and with him, the strange new capital at Amarna became a ghost city. Into this wreckage of faith and politics stepped Tutankhaten. He was young, far too young to understand the weight of divine kingship. At 9 years old, most children today are still losing baby teeth and tripping over their sandals. But in Egypt, youth wasn't an excuse. A pharaoh was the living Horus, chosen to bind the two lands together, even if his arms barely reached around the crook and flail. So here he stood, tiny but adorned in ceremonial regalia, while older men whispered behind him, already planning how to steer the kingdom through crisis. The coronation itself must have been dazzling. Picture towering pylons draped in banners, trumpets blaring through the temple precincts, and priests chanting hymns older than memory itself. Tutankhaten, his body still small enough to wobble under the weight of a crown, would have been led to the sacred shrine, anointed with oils, and presented to the gods as Egypt's rightful ruler. You can almost smell the mix of myrrh, lotus, and sweat of packed crowds under the desert sun. Behind the formality, though, there was unease. Would this boy be a puppet of powerful courtiers? Would the gods forgive the heresies of his father through him? The name he carried spoke volumes. Tutankhaten, living image of Aten. Aten, the very god his father had elevated above all others. That was not going to fly for long. Before his first decade of life was even finished, the boy king's name would shift to something far more traditional. Tutankhamun, living image of Amun. This wasn't just rebranding, it was survival. The priests of Amun, still smarting from Akhenaten's suppression, were eager to reclaim their central place in Egyptian life. The child king became the vessel for that restoration. But rewind a little further to see what sort of family he came from. Because this is where Egypt's royal family tree turns into a knot. Tutankhamun's father is widely believed to have been Akhenaten himself, though some scholars debate whether it could have been another Amarna prince. His mother, based on DNA studies of mummies, seems to have been a woman often called the Younger Lady, a full sister to Akhenaten. That makes Tutankhamun the product of sibling marriage, a practice not uncommon among royals who wanted to preserve divine bloodlines, but one that carried serious genetic risks. Those risks may explain some of the physical challenges Tutankhamun would face in life: clubfoot, fragile bones, malaria infections. Yet despite his fragile body, the aura of kingship wrapped him. At 9, he might have still been more fascinated by toys, pets, or racing little chariots than by temple politics. But the throne erased childhood. He suddenly carried the weight of empires. Egypt at the time was still one of the dominant powers in the Near East. its wealth drawn from gold mines in Nubia and trade stretching to the Levant and beyond. But Akhenaten's obsession with religion had neglected military campaigns, diplomacy, and the empire's reputation abroad. Tutankhamun inherited not just a throne, but a mess. He wasn't left alone in it, of course. Powerful adults gathered around him, like I, a senior courtier with priestly clout, and Horemheb, a military general who would one day claim the throne himself. They played the role of regents in all but name, tutoring the child pharaoh in how to walk the tightrope of royal duty while using his crown as their lever of influence. If you've ever been bossed around by teachers or relatives when you were a kid, multiply that by 10, and imagine them wearing leopard skins and waving scepters. Tutankhamun was king in theory, but in practice, he was being maneuvered by men far older and sharper. Still, Egyptians were pragmatic. A child king was better than no king. And the rituals carried on. Temples reopened, festivals revived, and the great statues of Amun-Ra once again received offerings. Tutankhamun's role was to smile, perform the sacred gestures, and let the machinery of tradition roar back to life. His very presence was a balm. The sight of a pharaoh in procession, even a boy, reassured people that order the mart was being restored after the chaos of Akhenaten's heresy. In those first years of his reign, the country breathed easier. Farmers ploughed the black silt of the Nile again, confident the gods would bless the floods. Craftsmen returned to their workshops, chiseling scarabs and amulets with renewed devotion. Priests strutted with a bit more pride, their gods once again in the spotlight. Tutankhamun may have been too small to enforce it, but his name change and symbolic gestures told Egypt that the old order was alive. Now, you might be wondering what daily life looked like for this boy on the throne. Imagine waking up in a palace lined with painted walls, showing lilies and hunting scenes. The air scented with incense, your attendants bustling in to dress you in linen softer than anything you've ever worn. Breakfast might be bread, figs, honey, maybe some roasted duck if the kitchen was feeling fancy. Then off to lessons, hieroglyphs, religious rituals, maybe a bit of archery practice if his health allowed. Every action was surrounded by ritual, because as king, even lifting a cup of wine carried symbolic weight. He was Horus incarnate after all, even if Horus occasionally needed help tying his sandals. But beneath the glitter of palatial life, there was fragility. Tutankhamun's body bore the marks of genetic inbreeding and disease. Modern scans of his mummy reveal a clubfoot, cleft palate, and evidence of malaria. This wasn't the invincible god-king of stone reliefs. It was a teenager who might have needed a cane to walk, his steps slow under the weight of ceremonial robes. And yet, in Egyptian art, he was shown smiting enemies, riding chariots, towering like a giant over captives. The propaganda machine never slept, and in fairness, no pharaoh could afford to look weak, not even a boy. As his reign began to take shape, the very act of existing, of being alive and present in the temples, processions, and ceremonies, was a political statement. Egypt was stable again, or at least pretending to be. The gods were back in their shrines, the empire was licking its wounds, and the boy who had once been Tutankhaten was now Tutankhamun, living image of Amun, symbol of restoration. And as the Nile rolled on outside his palace, swollen and glinting in the sun, Egyptians began to believe once more that the gods smiled upon them. For Tutankhamun, though, the journey had only begun, and the weight of a kingdom would test every fragile bone in his young body. Tutankhamun's family tree is as tangled as the roots of an acacia clinging to the Nile's banks. And untangling it means stepping into the complicated world of Amarna politics and royal bloodlines that looked more like a spider's web than a straight branch. You, perched on the edge of the throne room like some invisible observer, would quickly notice that everyone seemed to be related to everyone else, and often in ways that make modern family reunions look blissfully simple. Let's start with his father. Most scholars today believe Tutankhamun's father was Akhenaten, the pharaoh who had dragged Egypt into his religious revolution, elevating Aten, the solar disk, above all the other gods. Akhenaten himself had been born Amenhotep I, son of Amenhotep III, and Queen Tiye, before changing his name in honor of his new deity. This makes Tutankhamun the grandson of Amenhotep III, one of Egypt's most successful and opulent pharaohs, a man remembered for grand building projects and a relatively stable rule. That's a decent pedigree if you're trying to reassure people you're not just a fragile kid playing dress-up. Now his mother, the story grows murkier here. For years people speculated it could have been Nefertiti, Akhenaten's famous great royal wife, whose beauty was immortalized in that stunning bust. Now sitting in a Berlin museum, but DNA tests conducted in the early 2000s on royal mummies revealed a different reality. Tutankhamun's mother appears to have been a woman labeled the Younger Lady, discovered in tomb KV35. She was not Nefertiti but rather a lesser-known woman who was also Akhenaten's full sister. Yes, that means Tutankhamun's parents were siblings. Before you wrinkle your nose too hard, keep in mind that this wasn't unusual for Egyptian royalty. Pharaohs were considered divine, and divine blood needed to stay pure, even if that meant marriages between brothers and sisters. This policy of keeping things in the family came with genetic baggage. Tutankhamun's body revealed signs of congenital problems: a cleft palate, scoliosis, fragile bones, and a clubfoot. It's the sort of inheritance no golden crown could outweigh, and it shaped his life profoundly. Think of it as the darker side of a royal lottery. Yes, you get the throne, but you also get pain, weakness, and the possibility that a small accident could be fatal. The wider family web only complicates things further. Akhenaten had multiple wives and children, including 6 daughters with Nefertiti. These girls, Tutankhamun's half-sisters, were married into court or vanished from records during the Amarna turmoil. One of them, Akhenaten, later renamed Akhenaten, would marry Tutankhamun himself. That's right, his half-sister also became his queen. Again, not unusual for the royal house of Egypt, but it made for an even tighter loop of intermarriage. If you're feeling dizzy with the family chart already, welcome to the club. Tutankhamun's grandmother, Queen Ta, deserves special mention. She had been a powerful and politically astute queen consort during Amenhotep III's reign, respected and feared for her influence. Ta outlived her husband and saw the wild swings of Akhenaten's reign, possibly serving as a stabilizing presence. By the time Tutankhamun came to power, she may already have been dead, but her legacy lingered. Egyptians remembered her as a figure of legitimacy and continuity, something the boy king desperately needed to inherit. Then there's the ever-present shadow of Nefertiti. Though not his mother, she loomed large in the background. Some scholars argue she may have ruled briefly after Akhenaten's death under the name Neferneferetin, or even Smenkhkare. Others think she disappeared into obscurity. Either way, the artistic revolution of Amarna, those long, slender necks, protruding bellies and intimate family scenes, was shaped by Nefertiti and Akhenaten together. Tutankhamun's childhood would have unfolded against the backdrop of this visual and ideological revolution. Imagine being raised in palaces where walls showed your father and stepmother worshipping the Aten, their bodies rendered in strange, elongated forms that must have seemed unsettling to later generations. But what about siblings beyond the sisters? DNA evidence points to the fact that Tutankhamun had a half-brother or two, though their names remain speculative. There's mention of a prince named Smenkhkare, whose identity is still debated. Was he another son of Akhenaten, a co-regent, or perhaps even Nefertiti in disguise? If you're keeping track, that's yet another mystery swirling around the boy king's family. A reminder that in royal circles, power was never stable, and even identities could blur. Let's not forget the extended royal household. Uncles, cousins, courtiers tied by blood or by marriage. The 18th dynasty, Tutankhamun's house, was one of Egypt's most powerful, but by his time, it had become a tangle of rivalries. Harem politics also played a role. Pharaohs often had multiple wives and concubines, producing children who might one day stake a claim to the throne. Tutankhamun himself wasn't the first choice for stability. He was more like the child available to sit on the throne when the adults had run out of options. This messy family situation mattered because in Egypt, lineage was legitimacy. Every king claimed descent from gods, but ordinary people wanted continuity too. A pharaoh connected to Amenhotep III offered reassurance. Tutankhamun could claim both divine descent and bloodlines tied to a glorious past. That was gold in a world still reeling from Akhenaten's heresy. Now picture Tutankhamun as a boy, perhaps 8 years old, wandering the courtyards of Amarna's palaces. Around him, towering walls glittered with images of Aten's rays ending in hands. The city, newly built in the desert, was full of priests of Aten, foreign diplomats bewildered by the new cult, and artists experimenting with radical styles. He would have grown up breathing the atmosphere of upheaval, The sudden death of his father or father figure meant a swift pivot. He was whisked from Aten's blazing sun back into the cool shadows of Amun's temples. The boy who had been named living image of Aten was now expected to embody Amun, the god of Karnak, the hidden one. His very identity was rewritten by politics. The strain on such a young mind must have been immense. You're told your father was a godlike visionary. Then suddenly the adults around you whisper that he was a heretic, a destroyer of tradition. You wear a teen's name, then are told you must abandon it to survive. It's the sort of childhood whiplash that could confuse even the strongest personality. Tutankhamun had little choice but to nod, obey, and let his elders, men like I and Horemheb, shape him into the symbol Egypt needed. But symbols aren't free of personal cost. Genetic weaknesses already made Tutankhamun's life difficult. Growing up in a palace didn't exempt him from pain. His clubfoot may have forced him to rely on walking sticks, dozens of which were later found in his tomb. Malaria left lesions in his bones, sapping his energy. While his portraits in temples showed him charging into battle, the reality was likely that of a fragile youth, struggling to keep up with the demands of divine kingship. The royal lineage gave him power, but it also cursed him with vulnerability. And then there's the matter of heirs. Tutankhamun and Akhenaten attempted to produce children, but excavations reveal tragic evidence. 2 mummified fetuses were discovered in his tomb, likely their stillborn daughters. The genetic risks of sibling marriage may have played a role, sealing the dynasty's fate. The 18th dynasty, once mighty, was running out of viable heirs, its royal bloodline weakening with each generation of closed-circle unions. If you step back and squint at the whole picture, the boy king looks less like a triumphant ruler, and more like the last spark of a candle guttering out. He was the final direct heir of the great 18th dynasty, the dynasty that had given Egypt rulers like Thutmose III, Amenhotep III, and Hatshepsut. With Tutankhamun's death, the torch would pass not to a son but to opportunists like Ai and Horemheb, men who had hovered near the throne like vultures. His family, in trying to keep power pure, had ensured its extinction. But for now, in these early years, he was still surrounded by the remnants of that lineage. Priests who whispered about Amenhotep III's grandeur, courtiers who remembered Ta's authority, and artists still copying the strange styles of Amarna. He was the fragile thread connecting a golden past to an uncertain future. And as he grew from boy to adolescent, the weight of that family tree, glorious and doomed all at once, pressed heavier and heavier upon his thin shoulders. The story of Tutankhamun cannot be told without stepping squarely into the chaos left behind by his father, Akhenaten, whose reign had ripped Egypt apart at its spiritual seams. You find yourself standing in the hollowed streets of Amarna, the strange desert capital, Akhenaten carved from barren land. The wind whips fine sand through abandoned courtyards, and walls still bear the image of the Aten, the blazing solar disk, its rays stretching down like fingers, each hand offering life. But the city is eerily quiet now, its priests dispersed, its workshops empty. The grand experiment has collapsed, leaving behind a strange ghost town and a population trying to remember how to pray the old way again. This is the world that shaped Tutankhamun's early life, born into upheaval, crowned amidst suspicion, and tasked with restoring balance to a kingdom aching for stability. Akhenaten had taken the bold step of dismantling the polytheistic system that had served Egypt for nearly 2 millennia. Out went the sprawling priesthood of Amun at Karnak, the grand temples of Ptah at Memphis, and the countless local cults that tied villages to their gods. In their place rose Aten, a god of pure sunlight, stripped of mythology and reduced to a celestial disk. Akhenaten even changed his name from Amenhotep IV to signal his devotion. He wasn't just adjusting theology, he was rewriting the very foundation of Egyptian life. Imagine one morning waking up to discover that Christmas, Ramadan, Diwali, and every other holiday you've ever known have been cancelled, their temples bulldozed, and everyone is told to worship the sun at exactly noon instead. That was the level of disorientation ordinary Egyptians faced. To make matters worse, Akhenaten moved the royal court from Thebes, the traditional capital, to a brand new city he built in the desert, Akhenaten, today called Amarna. It was a stunning gesture, like a corporate CEO deciding overnight to uproot headquarters from New York to some windswept stretch of Nevada sand, then demanding everyone follow. The city was filled with new temples to Aten, built without roofs so sunlight could pour directly onto the altars. Sculptors developed a radical new art style: elongated heads, protruding bellies, intimate family scenes of Akhenaten, Nefertiti, and their daughters basking in Aten's glow. Gone was the rigid, idealized style of centuries. In its place was a strange mix of intimacy and alien beauty. But revolutions rarely run smoothly. The old priesthood, especially those tied to Amun, seethed as their temples were shuttered and their incomes dried up. Soldiers grumbled, as Akhenaten seemed more interested in hymns than in defending Egypt's borders. Diplomats complained that foreign powers like the Hittites and Mitanni sensed weakness in Egypt's distracted leadership. Ordinary farmers were confused. Should they still pray to Osiris for a safe afterlife? Or would Aten handle that now? The uncertainty gnawed at Egypt's soul. Tutankhamun's early childhood unfolded in the middle of this turmoil. Born Tutankhaten, living image of Aten, he embodied the new order in his very name. His earliest years were likely spent in Amarna, wandering palace halls painted with rays of Aten, and watching his father and stepmother perform rituals in sunlight. Imagine being a boy and seeing your father hailed not just as king, but as high priest of a new universal god, while everyone else whispered behind closed doors. It must have felt both glorious and isolating. By the time Akhenaten died, the system he built was already cracking. His successors, perhaps Smenkhare, perhaps Nefertiti under another name, tried briefly to hold Atenism together, but the momentum was gone. Priests of Amun began to stir. Generals who had been sidelined started flexing their muscles again. The old gods, suppressed but never forgotten, were waiting in the wings. Into this maelstrom, a boy of 9 was placed on the throne. Think about it. Tutankhaten's entire identity was wrapped in his father's failed revolution, and yet the very first thing he would have to do as king was reject it. Adults around him, the seasoned courtier, and Horemheb, the sharp-eyed general, understood that survival meant rolling back the clock. Egypt needed its gods back. The boy's name was changed to Tutankhamun, living image of Amun. That single act was like tearing down a giant billboard and putting up the old logo again. It told every farmer, every scribe, every priest that business as usual had returned. But it wasn't just a matter of switching names. Akhenaten's reign had left scars everywhere. Temples had been neglected or destroyed. Priesthoods had lost income, making them bitter and vengeful. Entire administrative systems had collapsed in the move to Amarna. Restoring the old order meant not only reopening sanctuaries, but rebuilding the machinery of state itself. Imagine being 9 years old and having your bedtime stories replaced with long speeches about temple endowments and grain distributions. Poor Tutankhamun barely had time to be a child. For ordinary Egyptians, though, the restoration was a relief. Suddenly, processions honoring Amun, Pa, Hathor, and Osiris returned. Festivals once banned were celebrated again with drums, beer, and dancing. Farmers could set up household shrines without fear of officials smashing their idols. In the flicker of oil lamps, as priests once again chanted the names of dozens of gods, people sighed with relief. The world felt normal again. Still, you can imagine the tension in palace halls. Every time Tutankhamun performed a ritual for Amun, he was in effect undoing his father's legacy. Every decree reinstating a temple chipped away at Akhenaten's dream. For a boy who likely remembered Aten's rituals from childhood, it must have been confusing, like switching religions overnight, because the grown-ups told you so. But the grown-ups knew better. Survival hinged on this reversal, and Tutankhamun, whether he liked it or not, became the face of restoration. Not everyone was ready to forgive and forget. In Thebes, priests took every chance to emphasize Amun's supremacy, reminding the public how dangerous it had been to abandon him. In Memphis, priests of Ptah demanded resources to repair their temples. Across Egypt, artisans went to work chiseling Akhenaten's name out of monuments, erasing him from memory. His statues were smashed, his images defaced, his city abandoned. It was as if the nation collectively decided to scrub him from history, hoping no one would ever remember the years of chaos. Ironically, of course, that act of erasure ensured his memory lasted. Tutankhamun's position in all this was precarious. His reign might have looked triumphant on the surface, temples rebuilt, festivals revived, statues of gods restored, but the reality was that adults pulled the strings. and Horemheb-controlled policy, while the boy king played the role of sacred figurehead. He may have practiced rituals and made appearances in ceremonies, but the heavy lifting of governance fell to others. Still, he was useful. People needed a pharaoh they could rally around, even if he was barely taller than the offering tables. And don't forget the international scene. While Egypt was cleaning up its religious mess, rivals abroad were watching. Letters from the Amarna archives show desperate pleas from Egyptian vassals in Canaan and Syria during Akhenaten's reign, begging for military help as Hittites and other powers encroached. Those pleas often went unanswered, as Akhenaten focused on Aten. Tutankhamun inherited that diplomatic fallout. Allies no longer trusted Egypt's strength, and enemies sensed weakness. Restoring temples was one thing. Restoring Egypt's prestige abroad was another. This was the tightrope Tutankhamun walked. Or rather, the tightrope his advisors walked for him while he clutched the balancing pole. At home, the gods had to be restored to keep the population calm. Abroad, Egypt needed to project power again, even if the boy king couldn't personally lead campaigns. In reliefs, he was shown riding chariots and smiting enemies, but in reality, his health and age made that unlikely. The art was propaganda, reinforcing the idea that Egypt was back on its feet. Amidst all this, imagine being Tutankhamun himself. He's still a teenager, his bones fragile, his body racked with pain, trying to learn hieroglyphs and rituals while being paraded through temples as a living god. One day he's Aten's son, the next he's Amun's servant. One day his father is hailed as visionary, the next he's reviled as heretic. For a boy who probably wanted to chase ducks by the river or race toy boats in the palace pools, it must have been dizzying. And yet, somehow, he carried it. With every step he took in public, leaning on canes, perhaps hidden beneath ceremonial robes, he reassured a shaken nation. The Amarna upheaval had left Egypt scarred, but the boy king, fragile though he was, became the bridge back to tradition. His reign didn't last long, but its symbolic weight was immense. He was living proof that even after chaos, Egypt could return to Maat, cosmic order, the balance between gods, king, and people. The first real mark Tutankhamun left on history, beyond simply wearing the crown, was the restoration of Egypt's gods and temples. If you picture Egypt as a vast body whose blood was the Nile, and whose bones were its monuments, then religion was its heartbeat. When Akhenaten disrupted that rhythm, the body convulsed. Tutankhamun's reign, though short, was about reviving that pulse, making sure the gods were once more fed, praised and feared. And while the boy himself may have been too frail to haul stones or draft decrees unaided, the machinery of restoration roared to life in his name. The first clue comes from what historians call the Restoration Stele. Erected early in Tutankhamun's reign, it proclaimed that the gods' temples had been neglected, their shrines overgrown, and their rituals abandoned during the chaos of Akhenaten's time. The stele described a country in disarray, temples collapsing, statues toppled, sanctuaries unused. In stirring poetic lines, it credits Tutankhamun with reopening sanctuaries, reinstating rituals, and restoring the land to its proper state. Whether or not the young king actually directed these efforts, the symbolism mattered. Egypt wanted to hear that its gods had been appeased, and the boy king gave them exactly that reassurance. Imagine Thebes at this moment. The sprawling temple complex of Karnak, once the pride of Amun's cult, had fallen quiet under Akhenaten. Priests had been dismissed, offerings dried up, festivals cancelled. Suddenly, under Tutankhamun, those vast halls reverberated again with chants. Scribes bustled to copy hymns, artisans hauled pigments to repaint carvings, and oxen were sacrificed on altars once more. The smell of burning incense mixed with roasting meat filled the courtyards, and the people, ordinary villagers, merchants, farmers, felt secure again knowing the gods were being honored properly. This wasn't just about faith. It was about politics. The priesthood of Amun was one of the most powerful forces in Egypt, commanding wealth, land, and influence. By restoring their central role, Tutankhamun's regime gained their loyalty. You could call it divine insurance. Put Amun back on his pedestal, and his priests would back the throne. Without that alliance, Tutankhamun might have been toppled before he hit puberty. The restoration extended beyond Amun. Temples to Ptah in Memphis, Ra in Heliopolis, Hathor in Dendera, and Osiris at Abydos all benefited. Imagine the workforce: lines of laborers hauling limestone blocks, artisans chiseling out reliefs, painters mixing ochre and lapis into vivid colors. On walls, Tutankhamun's figure reappeared in the traditional poses of pharaohs, offering incense, smiting enemies, pouring libations. The irony, of course, is that his body was frail and likely in pain, yet stone carved him as eternal, strong and unbending. Festivals once banned were revived. The Opet festival in Thebes, where Ammon's statue was carried in procession from Karnak to Luxor temple, returned in full glory. Imagine boats gilded in gold leaf floating down the Nile, crowds cheering, music echoing from drums and sistrums. For Egyptians, these weren't just parties, they were cosmic resets, rituals that ensured the gods renewed creation for another year. To see them return must have felt like breathing again after being underwater too long. Even language itself shifted. In official inscriptions, Tutankhamun's titles emphasized devotion to the traditional gods. The Aten still appeared occasionally, but now it was only one deity among many, stripped of its exclusivity. It's like a former monopoly suddenly reduced to a minor player on the board. Aten had been too closely tied to Akhenaten's heresy, and so, while not erased completely, it was sidelined. This restoration also required physical destruction. Across Egypt, teams of workers were dispatched to hack out Akhenaten's name from walls, to smash his statues, and to deface images of the Aten. The erasure was systematic, as though the state wanted future generations to forget the entire episode. Ironically, those very acts of destruction ensured archaeologists would one day know something dramatic had occurred. The gaps and scars told their own story. Of course, all of this restoration cost money. Temples had to be rebuilt, festivals funded, priests supported. Where did the resources come from? Egypt's wealth, drawn from Nubian gold and agricultural surplus, had been drained during Akhenaten's focus on religion. Now administrators had to scramble. Taxes were levied, treasures were redistributed, and the boy king's court probably tightened its belt, though not so much that golden trinkets stopped flowing into palace storerooms. It was a balancing act: keep the gods happy without bankrupting the state. One can picture Tutankhamun himself in these ceremonies, leaning on a staff, his youthful face painted with eyeliner, his thin frame swathed in linen. He may have struggled to walk, but attendants could help him stand before the gods. His job was not physical strength, but symbolic presence. Every gesture he made, lifting incense, pouring libations, presenting offerings, was amplified by the belief that he was the bridge between humanity and the divine. Even a shaky hand was enough, as long as it held the ritual vessel. The propaganda machine went into overdrive. Reliefs showed him hunting wild animals, a classic pharaonic activity symbolizing control over chaos. Scenes of him riding in a chariot, bow-drawn, smiting Nubians or Asiatics were carved into temple walls. Were these literal? Almost certainly not. With a clubfoot and fragile bones, it's doubtful Tutankhamun ever stood firm in a speeding chariot, but the image was what mattered. Egyptians didn't need their king to win actual battles. They needed him to embody the idea of victory, to reassure them the cosmos was still in order. In private moments, though, he must have felt the strain. He was still a teenager, caught between advisors who maneuvered for power and a priesthood, eager to reclaim dominance. Imagine being ushered into ceremonies where you had to play the role of God incarnate, while behind the curtain, adults whispered about taxes, diplomacy and war. He was both center stage and completely sidelined. Still, the restoration brought real results. Farmers once more offered their first fruits at temples. Priests recited hymns that had been silenced for a decade. The gods, in the minds of Egyptians, were satisfied, and that meant the Nile would flood, the crops would grow, and the dead would reach the afterlife. For a nation built on cosmic balance, nothing could be more important. Tutankhamun's reign may have been brief, but by overseeing this restoration, even if only in name, he helped stabilize Egypt after one of its most disruptive experiments. His youth and frailty were secondary. What mattered was that the rituals were back, the temples stood tall, and the heartbeat of Egypt once again kept steady time beneath the desert sun. And so, while his father's city of Amarna crumbled into ruins and was left to the jackals and sand, Tutankhamun's Egypt thrummed with life again. You can almost hear it: the chants of priests, the pounding of drums in festival processions, the chisels of artisans carving gods into stone. The boy king had brought the gods home, and for now, the people of Egypt could breathe easier. Tutankhamun's restoration of Egypt's gods didn't just secure the loyalty of priests and ease the fears of commoners. It also set the stage for one of the most politically charged unions in ancient history, his marriage to Akhenaten. And if you thought his family tree was tangled before, brace yourself, because this royal wedding was less about romance and more about survival for an embattled dynasty. Akhenaten was no stranger. She was his half-sister, daughter of Akhenaten and Nefertiti, born during the Amarna period, when Aten still ruled supreme. Her original name, Akhenaten, she lives through Aten, reflected that devotion. Like Tutankhamun, she had her childhood reshaped by the whiplash of Egypt's religious upheaval. She too went from basking in the Aten's rays in Amarna to kneeling before the towering statues of Amun at Thebes. Both children bore the heavy burden of their father's legacy, and both had their names rebranded to align with the restoration. Tutankhaten became Tutankhamun, Akhenaten became Akhenaten. Marriage between siblings was not unusual among Egyptian royals. In fact, it was almost expected. Pharaohs were seen as gods on earth, and their bloodlines were sacred. By marrying his half-sister, Tutankhamun reinforced his legitimacy. To the people, it symbolized continuity. The divine family remained united, the crown secure. To the priests and courtiers, it was a practical solution. No messy alliances with outsiders, no dilution of the royal line, and for Tutankhamun himself, it was probably less about choice and more about destiny. Imagine being a teenager and learning that your wedding wasn't just a family affair, but a political act designed to stabilize an empire. No pressure. The ceremony itself would have been dazzling. Picture Akhenaten, draped in fine linen, her skin oiled and perfumed with lotus and myrrh, standing beside the frail young king. Musicians would have played harps and flutes, dancers swayed in rhythmic devotion, priests invoked blessings from Amun and Hathor, goddess of love and joy. The union was celebrated, not only in palace halls, but inscribed in official art, where the couple is shown together more intimately than most royal pairs. In reliefs they appear seated side by side, exchanging flowers, their gestures tender. For all the political underpinnings, there may have been genuine affection between them. Akhenaten quickly became more than just a decorative queen. She carried the weight of dynastic continuity on her shoulders. Her duty was to produce heirs, sons who could secure the 18th dynasty's future. But fate dealt the couple a cruel hand. Excavations of Tutankhamun's tomb revealed two tiny mummies, believed to be their stillborn daughters. One was premature, the other carried to term but dead at birth. For a society obsessed with legacy, this was a devastating blow. Not only did the boy king's health seem precarious, but his line also failed to continue. You can imagine the whispers in the palace corridors. Priests and courtiers must have fretted about the dynasty's fragility. The deaths of the infants hinted at the genetic risks of sibling marriage. Though the Egyptians would not have understood it in those terms, they may have interpreted it as divine displeasure, a curse lingering from Akhenaten's heresy, perhaps simply tragic chance. Either way, the outcome was the same: no heir. Despite this, Akhenaten's presence remained politically essential. She represented the bridge between Akhenaten's radical reign and the restored traditions of Amun. Her marriage to Tutankhamun fused the two worlds, embodying both continuity and reconciliation. The people could look at her and see the daughter of Nefertiti, a queen once revered, now repurposed to stabilize the monarchy. In many ways, Akhenaten was as much a symbol as her young husband, but symbols still lived human lives. The surviving art of Tutankhamun and Akhenaten offers rare glimpses of intimacy in an otherwise rigid royal tradition. In one painted box found in his tomb, the queen is shown standing before the king, handing him arrows as he prepares for a hunt. In another, she adjusts his collar while he sits beneath a canopy. These aren't just political postures, they're domestic scenes, rare and tender. They hint at a partnership, maybe even a bond of comfort between two young people who had little control over their fates. Still, politics always hovered. Their union was meant to produce sons, and when it didn't, the future of the dynasty was thrown into question. Every year that passed without a living heir must have increased the pressure on both. For Tutankhamun, it underscored his fragility. For Akhenaten, it meant her own fate was tied to forces she could barely influence. Consider her position. A queen, barely out of childhood herself, married to a frail king, watched constantly for signs of pregnancy. Every miscarriage or stillbirth was not just personal grief, but a national crisis. And when Tutankhamun eventually died young, leaving her a widow with no heir, her desperation would lead to one of the most extraordinary episodes in Egyptian history, a plea to the Hittites, Egypt's rivals, to send her a husband. But that comes later. For now, in their teenage years, Tutankhamun and Akhenaten stood as the fragile center of a nation's hopes. In practical terms, their marriage also reinforced the influence of their advisors. Ay, the elder courtier, and Horemheb, the general, must have seen the union as a way to keep the throne insulated. With no external marriage alliances to complicate matters, they could more easily control the direction of policy. The couple might have sat on the throne, but the real hands steering the ship belonged to those older men hovering behind them. And yet, for the Egyptian people, perception mattered more than reality. They saw a young king and queen, resplendent in regalia, presiding over festivals and ceremonies. They saw images of harmony and devotion. They believed, for a time, that the dynasty's continuity was assured. In that belief lay stability. Akhenaten's very name change encapsulates the pivot of their era. From she lives through a 10 to she lives through a moon, she embodied the rejection of her father's failed experiment and the return to tradition. Her body, her marriage, her womb, all became instruments of political theatre. But beneath it all was a young woman navigating grief, duty and survival in the gold-plated cage of Egyptian royalty. So when you picture Tutankhamun's reign, don't just see the golden mask or the treasures buried with him. Picture also the queen at his side, half-sister, partner, and symbol draped in linen, her eyes rimmed with kohl, standing beside a boy whose frailty was hidden beneath the weight of divine kingship. Their marriage was Egypt's insurance policy, a human attempt to paper over cracks in the cosmic order, and though fate would deny them a lasting line, for those brief years their union was the fragile glue holding the dynasty together. If Tutankhamun and Akhenaten formed the ceremonial heart of the restored dynasty, the true pulse of power throbbed in the hands of their advisors. Behind every procession, decree, and festival, men of experience and ambition directed the course of Egypt. Two names rise above all others, i.e. the elder statesman, and Horemheb, the hardened general. Together they shaped the boy king's reign, guided Egypt back from the brink, and positioned themselves for their own eventual claims to the throne. A was old enough to remember the golden days of Amenhotep III, and had survived the turbulence of Akhenaten's religious revolution. His exact origins remain murky, but most agree he was not of royal blood. Some sources describe him as a relative of Queen Tiye, Tutankhamun's grandmother, which would have given him a natural place at court. By the time Tutankhamun took power, A was the seasoned voice of experience, a man who knew how to manipulate ritual, policy and palace intrigue with equal dexterity. As vizier, A held Egypt's highest bureaucratic office. He was the pharaoh's right-hand man, the one who stamped decrees, oversaw taxation, judged disputes, and supervised temple projects. If Tutankhamun's name adorned the restoration stele, it was A who likely dictated the words to the scribes. If the boy king presided at a temple ceremony, A was there ensuring the offerings were arranged, the hymns rehearsed, and the priests properly loyal. In many ways A was the puppet master, with Tutankhamun the marionette on the throne. Then came Horemheb, commander of the armies, where A wielded scrolls and rituals. Horemheb commanded spears and chariots. He was a soldier's soldier, a man hardened on campaigns in Nubia and the Levant. In reliefs from later years he shone striding confidently, jaw set, his body a sharp contrast to Tutankhamun's fragile frame. Horemheb was not content to serve quietly. He styled himself deputy of the king and positioned his image as the embodiment of pharaonic strength. Soldiers adored him, and in a land where military prestige was as valuable as divine favor, that adoration made him formidable. Together, A and Horemheb formed an uneasy partnership. A leaned on tradition, priests, and bureaucracy. Horemheb leaned on discipline, soldiers, and battlefield honor. Both needed Tutankhamun alive and compliant. A boy king gave them legitimacy. They could rule in his name, while securing their own futures. But they also knew that once he died, the throne might be open for grabs. The stakes were high, and every decision was layered with self-interest. Daily life at court reflected this web of influence. Imagine Tutankhamun, seated on a gilded throne, his feet barely touching the dais, while I stood beside him, reading proclamations. Behind them, Horemheb would stand in military regalia, a reminder of the steel behind the throne. Courtiers bowed, scribes recorded, priests muttered prayers, and all the while, the boy king tried to look regal, even as his mind drifted toward hunting scenes, painted on palace walls, or the aches in his bones. A's fingerprints can be seen in the religious restoration, the sweeping decrees that reopened temples, the language of cosmic balance. These were the words of a bureaucrat steeped in tradition. Horemheb's influence surfaced in Egypt's attempts to reassert military prestige. Reliefs show Tutankhamun leading campaigns against Nubians and Asiatics, but historians suspect these were propaganda pieces crafted under Horemheb's supervision. The boy king may have been physically unable to fight, but the imagery reassured Egypt's people and enemies alike. Their pharaoh was no weakling. It was a delicate balance. Aa needed the priests happy. Horemheb needed the soldiers loyal, and both needed Tutankhamun to project stability. For a while, the arrangement worked. Egypt seemed to hum with renewed confidence. Festivals resumed, granaries filled, scribes tallied harvests, artisans carved statues. On the surface, order had been restored. But beneath the calm, rivalries simmered. I and Horemheb were not natural allies. Each eyed the throne as a possibility, especially as Tutankhamun's health faltered, and his marriage produced no surviving heirs. I, older and steeped in palace ritual, likely imagined himself as a caretaker pharaoh, keeping the line of Amenhotep III alive in spirit, if not in blood. Horemheb, younger and vigorous, saw himself as the rightful protector of Egypt, the military strongman who could guarantee stability. The boy king's mortality was their opportunity. Tutankhamun himself must have sensed the tension. Picture him at a council meeting, shifting uncomfortably on his throne, as Horemheb argued over resources. Should more grain go to temple offerings or to supplying the army? Should laborers rebuild sanctuaries or fortify border outposts? His advisors spoke for him, but their rivalry seeped into every policy. For a teenager with limited power, it must have been like watching two uncles fight over inheritance while he sat awkwardly in the middle. Still, he was not entirely powerless. Tutankhamun's symbolic presence carried weight, and occasionally he asserted his role. Reliefs depict him participating in rituals, and inscriptions suggest he commissioned building works at Karnak and Luxor. These may have been heavily managed projects, but the fact that his name was inscribed signaled at least nominal agency. Even if I and Horemheb controlled the gears, Tutankhamun remained the face of the engine. The advisors' roles extended into Tutankhamun's personal life as well. When Akhenaten failed to produce an heir, the pressure fell on I and Horemheb to consider succession. Both likely positioned themselves quietly as potential solutions. I, as an elder statesman, may have whispered that he could marry the widowed queen if Tutankhamun died, preserving legitimacy. Horemheb, with his military following, may have hinted that his leadership would protect Egypt against foreign threats. The boy king's failing health was, for them, both a danger and an opportunity. It's tempting to imagine late-night scenes in the palace. I, in his chambers, dictating instructions to scribes, ensuring temple treasuries flowed smoothly. Horemheb pacing in military camps, reviewing troop rosters, ensuring loyalty ran to him as much as to the throne. And in another wing, Tutankhamun lying on a bed, feverish, perhaps racked by malaria, his cane resting beside him. Around him hovered physicians, priests, and attendants, but the decisions about Egypt's future were already being calculated elsewhere. The dynamic between boy king and advisors is not unique in history. You see echoes of it in child monarchs of medieval Europe, in shoguns of Japan, in emperors of China, all figureheads surrounded by ambitious regents. What makes Tutankhamun's case striking is the brevity of his reign and the sheer fragility of his body. He was never strong enough to break free of their shadow. His reign was their stage, and he the actor playing the divine role. Yet, to the Egyptian people, this mattered little. They didn't care who whispered in palace corridors as long as the gods were fed. The Nile flooded, and the kingdom looked strong. I and Horemheb knew this, and they played their parts well. The boy king's reign projected order, even if the real power lay in the hands of others. For Tutankhamun, though, it must have been suffocating. Imagine being treated like a living god in public but a pawn in private. Every gesture you made was scripted, every word monitored, every action corrected, and behind you 2 ambitious men watched, calculating not only your reign, but your death. It's a wonder he smiled at all in those reliefs where Akhenaten adjusts his collar or offers him flowers. In the end, the advisors defined his reign as much as he did. I's bureaucratic skill and Horemheb's military might steered Egypt through recovery, even as their rivalry set the stage for what would follow after the boy king's untimely death. Tutankhamun may have worn the crown, but I and Horemheb held the scepter. If you had wandered into Tutankhamun's palace in Memphis or Thebes, you'd have stepped into a world as carefully ordered as a temple relief. Every corridor humming with servants, scribes, priests, guards, and courtiers. Life at the court of the boy king was a blend of dazzling splendor and suffocating hierarchy, where every detail, down to the way a servant poured wine, reminded you who held power and who did not. And though Tutankhamun himself was frail and young, his court remained the beating heart of Egypt's political, religious, and cultural life. The palace itself was less like a castle of stone, and more like a sprawling compound of mud brick, painted in bright colors, its walls covered with scenes of hunting, festivals, and gods, columns shaped like papyrus stalks or palm trunks, held up open courtyards, while pools filled with lotus flowers reflected the blazing sun. Imagine walking through those halls, incense drifting in the air, walls glinting with pigments of blue and gold, the murmur of sandals on polished floors, the rustle of linen as courtiers swept past. Tutankhamun's daily life would have followed a rhythm dictated by ritual as much as practicality. In the mornings he was attended by a cluster of servants, some to bathe him, others to anoint him with oils, dress him in linen, and arrange his jewelry. Attendants adjusted his headdress, applied the kohl that rimmed his eyes, and handed him a staff or cane, without which he may have struggled to walk. Even this intimate routine was a performance. Servants treated him not as a boy but as a living god, their gestures deferential, their voices soft. Then came the ceremonies. Each day might bring a procession to a temple, an offering to a deity, or an audience with priests and advisors. The pharaoh was the linchpin of Ma'at, the divine order, and so his presence in rituals was as essential as water in the Nile. Even if I drafted the decrees and Horemheb enforced them, Tutankhamun's face was the one people saw lifting incense to Amun, or pouring wine before Osiris. Without him, the machinery of state would look hollow. Beyond ritual, the court buzzed with activity. Scribes bent over papyrus, recording harvest yields, temple accounts or decrees. Messengers arrived breathless from the frontiers, bearing news of Nubian uprisings or Hittite maneuvers. Artisans worked in palace workshops, crafting furniture inlaid with ivory, chariots trimmed with gold, or jewelry fit for a king and queen. Musicians played harps, lutes, and flutes to entertain guests at feasts, while dancers spun in rhythm to the clap of hands. Feasts themselves were spectacles. Picture Tutankhamun reclining on a low couch, Akhenaten beside him, while servants brought trays piled high with roasted duck, figs, honey cakes, and jars of wine. Courtiers flattered, musicians played, and acrobats performed tricks that made the guests laugh. Of course, the boy king's fragile health may have limited his appetite or stamina, but appearances mattered. To see the pharaoh dining grandly reassured everyone that Egypt's ruler was strong and blessed. Hierarchy defined every corner of this life. At the top sat the royal couple, semi-divine, untouchable. Next came the vizier, handling bureaucracy, followed by high priests, generals like Horemheb, and nobles overseeing provinces. Beneath them swarmed layers of lesser officials, scribes, craftsmen, servants, and guards. Everyone knew their place, and everyone watched for opportunities to rise or to fall. To cross the wrong advisor could mean exile or worse. To flatter the right one could mean sudden promotion. The palace wasn't just a home, it was a hive of ambition. Religion permeated everything. Priests moved through the palace as easily as courtiers, performing blessings, interpreting omens, or advising on rituals. At times, their presence must have made the palace feel more like a temple. Statues of gods stood in alcoves, and offerings of bread, beer, and flowers appeared daily. Even the king's meals were sometimes ritually shared with deities, as if Amun himself sat at the table. Despite the grandeur, there were moments of humanity. Archaeological finds from Tutankhamun's tomb suggest he had board games like Fascinate, a favorite pastime in Egypt, where pieces were moved along a grid to represent the soul's journey to the afterlife. You can imagine the young king hunched over the board with Akhenaten, or a trusted servant, throwing knucklebone dice, grinning when fortune favored him. Pets were also part of palace life. Dogs, cats, and even trained monkeys provided companionship. These were small comforts in a world where every public gesture was scripted. Tutankhamun's court also reflected Egypt's international connections. Foreign envoys brought gifts. Lapis from Afghanistan, cedar from Lebanon, incense from Punt. Some were tributes from vassal states eager to keep Egypt's favor. Others were gestures of diplomacy meant to secure alliances. These exotic goods made their way into palace storerooms, where scribes tallied them and artisans repurposed them into luxury items. For courtiers, such exchanges were a reminder that Egypt still sat at the center of a wide and interconnected world. But court life wasn't just pageantry. Beneath the glitter ran veins of anxiety. Everyone knew the king was young and sickly. His marriage had produced no surviving children. Whispers about succession flitted through the halls like moths around an oil lamp. And Horemheb maneuvered subtly, cultivating allies, watching each other as much as they watched over the king. For lesser courtiers, survival meant aligning with the right faction. To back the wrong man could mean ruin, when the throne inevitably changed hands. Yet for the people outside palace walls, none of this intrigue mattered as long as the image of kingship endured. They saw Tutankhamun and Akhenaten parading in gilded chariots, showering offerings on temples, blessing festivals. They smelled incense burning at dawn, as priests invoked the gods in the king's name. They believed, at least on the surface, that their pharaoh was strong, their gods appeased, and their world secure. The court's job was to maintain that illusion, no matter how fragile it was behind closed doors. In a sense, Tutankhamun's court was both a theatre and a sanctuary. It was theatre in that every act was performed for public reassurance. The king smiling, the queen offering flowers, the vizier proclaiming decrees, the general standing tall in armor. But it was sanctuary too, a place where rituals, traditions, and luxuries shielded the royal family from the chaos outside. For Tutankhamun, fragile and weary, the court may have been equal parts prison and protection. He was never free of eyes upon him. Yet within those walls he could at least lean on the machinery of state to hold Egypt together. So, if you close your eyes and imagine yourself there, you'd see a boy king propped up on gilded thrones, a queen adjusting his collar with tender precision, advisors whispering in corners, and servants scurrying like ants with trays of food, scrolls, and incense burners. You'd hear the distant beat of drums from the temples, the clatter of scribes' reed pens, the laughter of nobles at feasts, the hushed voices of priests invoking gods. And you'd realize that Tutankhamun's court was less about one boy's will, and more about an entire system working tirelessly to keep the illusion of divine kingship alive. The splendor of Tutankhamun's court masked a harsher truth. The boy who wore the double crown was fragile, burdened with health problems that made even simple movements painful. For centuries his statues showed him as a striding, youthful pharaoh, smiting enemies with muscular arms and charging chariots across battlefields. Yet modern science has peeled back that polished facade, and what it reveals is a boy whose body was far from the ideal carved in stone. His health shaped not only his daily life but also his ability to rule, casting a shadow over his reign and fueling the urgency of those who guided him. The first clues came from his tomb itself. Among the golden chariots, thrones, and jewelry, archaeologists found over 100 walking sticks. They weren't ceremonial props. They showed signs of real use, worn tips that suggest Tutankhamun leaned on them constantly. For a young man celebrated in art as a warrior, the sheer number of canes paints a sobering picture. Egypt's living god may have struggled simply to walk across his own palace. Forensic studies of his mummy add more detail. CT scans have revealed a clubfoot, scoliosis, and fragile bones in his legs. One leg, in particular, showed signs of necrosis, a degenerative condition that may have caused immense pain. Combined with the discovery of walking sticks, this suggests Tutankhamun often limped or required assistance. Picture him in a ceremonial procession, swathed in linen and gold, leaning subtly on a staff, while attendants discreetly steadied him. To the crowd, he was radiant. In reality, every step might have been an effort. Genetic testing has also pointed toward multiple cases of malaria in his short life. Malaria was not uncommon in ancient Egypt, where the Nile's marshlands bred mosquitoes, but for a king with already fragile health, repeated infections could have been debilitating. Fever, chills, fatigue, these symptoms would have drained his energy, leaving him too weak to endure the strenuous rituals expected of a pharaoh. Imagine him lying in bed, drenched in sweat, while priests waited impatiently for him to appear at a festival. His cleft palate and elongated skull, traits seen in CT scans, suggest the effects of inbreeding. As we've seen, Tutankhamun was the child of siblings, a practice that reinforced dynastic legitimacy but magnified genetic risks. The royal family's determination to keep its blood pure may have left him with a body too frail for the role thrust upon it. In this sense, his health was not just a personal struggle, but a symptom of a dynasty nearing collapse. Despite his physical challenges, the state's propaganda machine worked tirelessly to present him as strong. Reliefs show him standing tall in battle, drawing bows, or swinging a mace over enemies. On a painted box from his tomb, he is depicted riding a chariot, shooting arrows into swarms of foes. Yet close analysis reveals inconsistencies. His depictions show him drawing heavy composite bows which require strength and balance, skills nearly impossible for someone with his foot deformities and brittle bones. Scholars now believe these images were symbolic, not literal, designed to reassure Egypt that its pharaoh was vigorous, even if the reality was otherwise. Daily life for Tutankhamun must have been a constant negotiation with his body. Simple activities like climbing stairs, standing for long rituals, or even walking from chamber to chamber would have required effort. The canes in his tomb weren't just practical, they may have been cherished aids, personalized tools that gave him a sense of independence. One can imagine him favoring certain canes, decorated with ivory or gold, not only as supports but as symbols of authority he could physically lean on. His health likely influenced the way others treated him. Courtiers like I and Horemheb must have seen his fragility as both a liability and an opportunity. On the one hand, a weak pharaoh risked undermining Egypt's image of divine kingship. On the other hand, his dependence on advisors gave them greater power. Every ritual he could not perform, every audience he had to cut short, created space for them to step in. His body, in effect, dictated the balance of power at court. Yet it would be wrong to imagine Tutankhamun as entirely passive. Evidence suggests he took part in hunting, perhaps in controlled settings. Some reliefs show him shooting birds with a throw stick or pursuing animals from a chariot. These may have been carefully staged events, symbolic hunts that allowed him to embody pharaonic strength without the risks of real battle. If so, they reveal a young man trying, in his own limited way, to fulfill expectations despite his disabilities. The medical evidence also sheds light on his premature death. For decades, scholars debated whether he had been murdered, perhaps by a blow to the head, since early X-rays seemed to show skull damage. Later studies, however, suggest this was post-mortem, caused by rough handling during mummification. The more likely explanation is that his fragile health, compounded by an infected broken leg and malaria, ended his life at around 18 or 19. A seemingly minor accident, falling from a chariot, stumbling on a staircase, could have been catastrophic for someone with brittle bones. The tragic irony is that the very dynasty that produced such wealth and splendor may have sown its own doom through inbreeding. Tutankhamun's disabilities were not accidents of fate, but consequences of a system designed to keep divine bloodlines intact. His short, painful life was a human cost of the royal family's obsession with purity and legitimacy. And yet, despite his frailty, Tutankhamun remained the linchpin of Egypt's order. His people didn't see his clubfoot or his malaria fevers. They saw a golden mask, a radiant child king restoring balance after chaos. For them, the illusion mattered more than the truth. The gods did not require perfection of the body, only the performance of ritual and the symbol of continuity. Tutankhamun, though fragile, gave them that. So as you picture him, leaning on a staff, sweating through fevers, grimacing at the pain in his leg, remember also the layers of paint, gold and ritual that covered his weakness. The boy king's body may have been frail, but his role was larger than life. His health shaped his reign in ways unseen by his people. Yet in their eyes, he was the living image of Amun, the one who had brought the gods back to their rightful places. Fragility behind the mask, strength in the myth. That was the paradox of Tutankhamun's kingship. While Tutankhamun's body betrayed weakness, Egypt's empire required strength, not just on its borders, but in the halls of diplomacy where letters, gifts and marriages held as much weight as armies. To understand the boy king's reign, you need to picture him not just within the palaces of Thebes or Memphis, but also in the wider world of the Late Bronze Age, a network of powerful kingdoms stretching from Anatolia to Mesopotamia. In that international web, Egypt had long been a heavyweight, but after the turbulence of Akhenaten, Tutankhamun inherited a reputation that needed repair. We know about this world thanks in part to the Amarna letters, clay tablets inscribed with cuneiform, discovered in the ruins of Akhenaten. They preserve a record of correspondence between Egypt and its neighbors during Akhenaten's reign. Open them up, and you can almost hear the voices of foreign kings pleading, boasting, or cajoling. Kings of vassal cities in Canaan beg for troops to defend against raids. The king of Babylon negotiates marriage alliances. The king of Mitanni demands gold as part of friendship treaties. What leaps off the tablets is how disengaged Akhenaten had been, ignoring pleas, neglecting allies, focusing instead on hymns to Aten. By the time Tutankhamun took the throne, Egypt's image abroad was tarnished. Allies doubted its reliability, and enemies tested its defenses. Hittites in Anatolia expanded aggressively, pressing into Syrian territories once under Egyptian influence. The Mitanni kingdom, once a crucial ally, teetered under Hittite pressure. To the south, Nubians watched carefully for any chance to assert independence. Egypt, once unshakable, now looked vulnerable. One fascinating episode of international intrigue would only unfold after his death. When Akhenaten, widowed and desperate, wrote to the Hittite king Suppiluliuma, asking for one of his sons as her husband. That extraordinary letter, preserved in Hittite archives, shows just how precarious the dynasty's position had become. But even during Tutankhamun's lifetime, the seeds of that desperation were being sown. No heirs, an ailing king, and foreign powers sensing weakness. Marriage was another tool of diplomacy. Though Tutankhamun's union with Akhenaten limited foreign options, in previous generations, Egyptian princesses had married into foreign courts, sealing alliances. But Egypt rarely allowed its royal daughters to leave, preferring instead to demand foreign brides for Egyptian kings. Tutankhamun, married within his own family, didn't expand these alliances through matrimony. Instead, his court relied on gifts and gestures of friendship. Tutankhamun's advisors recognized this. If restoring temples healed Egypt's spirit, restoring diplomacy was essential to heal its reputation. Letters once again began flowing between courts. Ambassadors arrived bearing gifts. Fine horses from Anatolia, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, cedar wood from Lebanon. In return, Egypt sent gold, always gold. Foreign kings constantly asked for it, praising Egypt's endless mines in Nubia. In these exchanges, Tutankhamun's name appeared as sender, though it was almost certainly I or Horemheb dictating the details. Still, the boy king's seal restored a sense of legitimacy. If Tutankhamun's diplomatic ties helped hold Egypt's empire together, the other pillar of his reign was military imagery. Whether or not he ever swung a sword in anger, for the Egyptians, a pharaoh who could not fight was almost unthinkable. Kings were the smiters of chaos, the earthly embodiment of Horus trampling enemies underfoot. Even when a pharaoh was young, frail, or absent from campaigns, the state still needed to present him as a warrior. In Tutankhamun's case, this was doubly true. His health may have limited his real participation in battle, but his monuments, artifacts, and art overflow with images of him as a conquering hero. One of the most striking pieces comes from his tomb, a painted wooden chest, sometimes called the war chest. On its panels, Tutankhamun is shown larger than life, standing tall in a chariot as he fires arrows into swarms of foreign enemies. On one side, Nubians collapse under his attack. On another, Asiatics tumble in chaos. His horses rear dramatically, their manes flying, while the boy king, in perfect balance, rains destruction. The message is clear. Egypt's king is victorious on every front. Yet the irony is sharp. The same tomb held dozens of canes that suggest he needed help to walk. Could such a king really have drawn a heavy bow from a bouncing chariot? Archaeologists debate this. Some suggest Tutankhamun may have participated in ceremonial hunts or staged military reviews, enough to create plausible scenes of him as a warrior. Others argue the imagery is pure propaganda, symbolic rather than literal. In either case, the message mattered more than the truth. Egyptians seeing those images didn't ask whether the boy king had really killed Nubians or Asiatics. They saw their pharaoh doing what every pharaoh must, defeating chaos, ensuring Ma. The propaganda extended to temple reliefs. At Karnak and Luxor, Tutankhamun appears in traditional warrior poses, smiting bound captives with a mace, trampling enemies beneath his feet. Inscriptions praise him as a mighty ruler who restored Egypt's honor. These were formulaic, of course. Almost every pharaoh commissioned similar scenes. But in Tutankhamun's case, the repetition was especially important. His frail body may have prevented real campaigns, but stone could portray him as eternally strong. That said, there is some evidence he may have been present at military events. Chariots found in his tomb were functional, not purely ceremonial. They show wear, suggesting actual use. One theory holds that Tutankhamun may have participated in controlled hunts or parades, perhaps riding in chariots for display, even if others handled the real dangers. If so, his participation may have carried risks. Some scholars believe a severe leg fracture, visible in CT scans of his mummy, may have come from a chariot accident. If true, his attempts to embody the warrior role may have contributed to his death. Regardless of the details, the point is clear. Tutankhamun's reign needed him to appear as a fighter. Egypt's enemies were not imaginary. The Hittites expanded aggressively in Syria, Nubia remained restive in the south, and local rebellions threatened Egyptian vassals in Canaan. While there is no firm evidence Tutankhamun personally led campaigns, his generals, especially Horemheb, almost certainly kept the army active. Records suggest Horemheb commanded forces in the Levant during this period, restoring some Egyptian control. But victories won by generals had to be credited to the king. That was the logic of divine kingship. The pharaoh was the source of all power, even if others wielded it. Military symbolism wasn't limited to violence. It also extended to the king's role as hunter. Pharaohs often portrayed themselves hunting lions, ostriches, or wild cattle, symbols of chaos. Tutankhamun followed this pattern. Art shows him hurling throw sticks at birds, loosing arrows at game, or riding chariots in the desert. Again, whether he actually did so is unclear, but the imagery reinforced the same point. The king controlled nature as well as nations. The everyday Egyptians watching these images, or hearing of victories, probably didn't question the details. For them, the king's symbolic triumphs were enough. Seeing Tutankhamun strike down Nubians, or Asiatics in reliefs, reassured them that Egypt remained strong. Hearing that their pharaoh had restored order abroad, soothed the anxieties left from Akhenaten's neglect. In a world where reality was often fragile, myth was a form of truth. It's worth remembering, too, that military might wasn't just about defending borders, it was about prestige. A pharaoh's reputation abroad influenced diplomacy, trade, and even domestic stability. If foreign kings thought Egypt weak, they might withhold gifts, seize vassal lands, or invade. If Egyptians themselves thought their king weak, they might question the cosmic order. Tutankhamun's military imagery, therefore, was as much a weapon as any spear. Yet, behind the painted scenes and carved reliefs, the contrast must have been painful. Imagine the boy king, thin and limping, carried to ceremonies where he was depicted as a chariot warrior. Imagine the effort required for him to sit upright for long rituals, while stone walls proclaimed his vigor. For Tutankhamun, the burden of kingship was not only political, but personal. He had to live daily with the gap between image and reality. This gap may explain the intensity of the propaganda. The more fragile the king, the stronger the imagery had to be. Reliefs of Tutankhamun smiting enemies weren't just tradition, they were overcompensation. His court understood that a pharaoh's strength was psychological as much as physical, so they carved him taller, stronger, more commanding than ever. In the end, whether Tutankhamun ever fought a battle matters less than the fact that his reign projected the image of a warrior. For Egyptians, the image was reality. Their boy king may have leaned on canes in private, but in public he was eternal, a conqueror of chaos, a hunter of beasts, a protector of Egypt. And that, in the fragile years after Mana, was exactly what the nation needed. The story of Tutankhamun bends inevitably toward his early death, a mystery that has fascinated scholars, archaeologists, and curious minds for over 3,000 years. At barely 19, the boy who had restored the gods, paraded as a warrior, and sat at the center of Egypt's rituals was suddenly gone. His reign had lasted only about a decade, yet his death left ripples that would shape not only Egypt's political future, but also the way later generations remembered him. The question that hovers over his mummy, like desert heat shimmering on stone, is simple: how did he die? The first theories emerged long before CT scans and DNA analysis. When Howard Carter discovered Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922, the mummy was in poor condition. Resin poured during embalming had burned the body in a chemical reaction, leaving it charred and brittle. Early X-rays taken in the mid-20th century suggested a fracture at the back of the skull. Almost immediately, whispers of foul play filled the air. Had the boy king been murdered, perhaps by a blow to the head? The theory seemed irresistible. After all, his death came at a politically convenient moment for men like I and Horemheb, both of whom would later wear the crown. But later studies complicated the story. CT scans in 2005 revealed that the skull damage was not the result of a blow during life, but rather post-mortem mishandling, likely from Carter's team or the embalming process itself. The murder by head wound theory crumbled. Instead, researchers found something else. A severe fracture in Tutankhamun's left leg, just above the knee. The bone was shattered and tissue traces showed infection. Combined with DNA evidence of multiple malaria infections, a new possibility emerged. Tutankhamun may have suffered a catastrophic injury, perhaps from a fall, perhaps from a chariot accident that became infected and worsened by malaria, led to his death. It's an oddly mundane end for someone so famous. No dramatic palace conspiracy, no dagger in the night. But instead a tragic accident compounded by disease. Yet in the ancient world, such accidents were often fatal. Medical knowledge was limited. Infection could spread quickly. Even a minor wound could kill. Imagine a fragile young man, already limping on a clubfoot, thrown from a chariot, or stumbling on palace stairs. His leg shatters, fever sets in, and within days or weeks the living image of Amun is dead. Still, suspicion lingers. Could I or Horemheb have seen his weakness as opportunity? Some argue the timing of events. I conducting Tutankhamun's burial, Horemheb later erasing his name from monuments, suggests ambition, but no definitive evidence points to murder. The more likely truth is that Tutankhamun's body, compromised by inbreeding and disease, simply gave out. His reign had always been a race against fragility, and fragility won. For Akhenaten, his queen and half-sister, the loss must have been devastating. Not only did she lose her partner, but she also lost the fragile protection his kingship provided. With no surviving children, the dynasty teetered on the edge of extinction. A desperate letter to the Hittite king, written soon after Tutankhamun's death, shows the terror she faced. They say you have many sons. Give me one of your sons, and he shall be my husband. I will never take one of my subjects as husband. The plea is extraordinary. A queen of Egypt asking a foreign rival for a husband. It shows how dire the situation was. Without Tutankhamun, Akhenaten's fate was uncertain, her throne vulnerable to men like I who lurked nearby. Meanwhile, the Egyptian court scrambled. The boy king's body had to be prepared for burial. And fast. Traditional embalming was elaborate. But evidence suggests his mummification was rushed, botched even. The burned, brittle state of his remains may have been caused by a chemical mishap, resin applied too hot, or in the wrong mixture. The small tomb in which he was buried, KV 62, also suggests haste. Scholars believe it was not originally built for him, but repurposed. Perhaps because his death came so suddenly. Pharaohs usually spent decades preparing vast, decorated tombs. Tutankhamun got a cramped chamber, painted quickly with scenes of his burial rituals, his name inserted where needed. It was a king's burial, on a commoner's timetable. The irony is sharp. His death, so ordinary and unprepared, led to the most extraordinary archaeological discovery of the modern era. Because he was buried in a small, quickly sealed tomb, it escaped the plundering that stripped other pharaohs' graves. His treasures remained intact, waiting until Carter's team stumbled upon them millennia later. In a way, Tutankhamun's early death preserved his immortality. Had he lived longer, built a grander tomb, and been buried in a larger chamber, looters would have stripped it bare long before the 20th century. Still, for his contemporaries, his death was a crisis. The fragile illusion of stability he had embodied cracked. A stepped in swiftly, performing the burial rites, perhaps even marrying Akhenaten briefly to cement his claim. Horemheb, biding his time, would later seize the throne outright. Tutankhamun himself, despite his role in restoring Amun, was largely forgotten. Later pharaohs, eager to erase the Amarna period and its aftermath, omitted his name from king lists. For centuries his reign vanished from memory. his monuments usurped by successors, his story swallowed by sand. And so the boy king who had ruled in the shadow of stronger men, who had struggled with frailty and failed to secure heirs, slipped into obscurity. His death was not marked with grandeur, but with haste. His name did not echo in temple lists, but was rubbed out. For the Egyptians he was a fragile bridge between heresy and restoration, useful while alive, but expendable once gone. Only much later, with Carter's discovery, would Tutankhamun rise again, not as the powerful king he was depicted in art, but as the fragile boy he truly was, immortalized not by deeds but by death. When Tutankhamun died suddenly in his late teens, Egypt faced a scramble. Pharaohs were supposed to prepare for death over decades, carving out colossal tombs, decorating walls with spells, and commissioning treasure to guide their Ka into the afterlife. Tutankhamun had no such luxury. His unexpected death left artisans, priests and officials rushing to bury him properly, while maintaining the illusion of timeless grandeur. The result was one of history's most famous paradoxes, the richest royal tomb ever found, yet one that was never meant for him. The tomb itself, KV 62 in the Valley of the Kings, is surprisingly small, tiny compared to the sprawling complexes of other New Kingdom pharaohs. It consists of just a few chambers, an antechamber crammed with goods, a side annex, a burial chamber, and a small treasury. Most Egyptologists believe the tomb was originally intended for someone of lower rank, perhaps a noble or minor queen. When Tutankhamun died, unexpectedly, his court seized the unfinished tomb as a stopgap. Better a modest tomb sealed quickly than a grand one, left incomplete. Inside, the rush is obvious. The burial chamber's walls are painted, but the work looks hurried compared to the elaborate reliefs and texts that adorn other royal tombs. Only one set of scenes decorates the chamber, images of Tutankhamun, before Osiris of his successor Ai performing the opening of the mouth ritual, and of the boy king embraced by deities. The style is almost cartoonish, the paint applied rapidly, as though the artisans had no time to achieve the usual finesse. It's like hiring a painter to finish a cathedral mural in the time it takes to decorate a living room. Even the burial equipment shows signs of improvisation. His outermost coffin was made of wood, covered in gold leaf, lavish, yes, but not the massive stone sarcophagus or granite coffin seen in other pharaohs' burials. The innermost coffin, made of solid gold, is extraordinary. Yet scholars note that some of the fittings look as though they were repurposed from other burials. The famous golden death mask itself may not have been made originally for him. Close study suggests the face was reworked, possibly adapted from a mask intended for a female. In the frantic rush to bury the king, artisans scavenged whatever treasures were available, customizing them where necessary. The embalming process, too, appears botched. Normally royal embalmers carefully preserved bodies with natron salts and resin. Tutankhamun's body, however, was badly damaged. CT scans reveal that his corpse may have burned spontaneously inside the coffin, the result of embalming materials igniting in a chemical reaction. Resin was poured onto the body while still hot, essentially cooking it. Whether this was incompetence or haste, the effect was devastating. Far from the perfect preservation Egyptians prized, Tutankhamun's mummy was blackened, brittle, and fragmented. For a people obsessed with eternal bodies, it was a shocking failure. Why the rush? Several factors converged. Tutankhamun's sudden death left little time. Political urgency demanded a swift burial. A king's body could not lie unburied, for it risked unrest and cosmic imbalance. Meanwhile, the court needed to secure the succession quickly, with Ai stepping in as pharaoh. Tutankhamun's funeral, therefore, was both a religious necessity and a political performance. The faster he was buried, the faster Egypt could move forward. Despite the haste, the tomb overflowed with riches. The antechamber was piled chaotically with furniture, chariots, beds, and statues, many stacked haphazardly as though shoved inside at the last minute. The annex was cluttered with food offerings, wine jars, and daily objects, everything a king might need in eternity, from linen garments to board games. The treasury held ritual shrines, canopic jars, and the mummified remains of stillborn children, likely Tutankhamun's daughters. The burial chamber, though small, housed the nested coffins and sarcophagus, each layer more dazzling than the last. What's remarkable is how personal these goods feel. Tutankhamun's sandals, inscribed with images of enemies so that he trampled them with each step. His thrones, decorated with scenes of him and Akhenaten in intimate poses, jewelry inlaid with turquoise and lapis, even jars of honey and baskets of fruit, now shriveled but once fresh. They remind us that behind the god-king was a young man whose court wanted him to be comfortable in the afterlife. The rush also left traces of improvisation. Some objects bore inscriptions originally dedicated to other royals, hastily altered to bear Tutankhamun's name. One of the golden shrines in the treasury may have been made for someone else entirely. It's as if the workshops of Thebes had been raided for anything suitable, names scraped off and repainted. To modern eyes, it looks sloppy. To ancient Egyptians, it was practical. Eternity couldn't wait. Imagine the scene in the Valley of the Kings during those frantic weeks. Artisans hammering gold sheets, painters mixing pigments, embalmers chanting prayers as they worked feverishly. Courtiers oversaw the process, anxious to finish before unrest brewed. Priests rehearsed burial rituals, ensuring no step was missed even if details were rushed. And in the center of it all lay the boy king's fragile body, prepared as best as possible for a journey it seemed no one expected him to take so soon. The funeral itself must have been elaborate, despite the haste. The body was transported to the tomb in procession, accompanied by priests, mourners, and soldiers. Incense filled the air, women wailed in ritual lament. At the tomb, priests performed the opening of the mouth ceremony, touching tools to the mask so that Tutankhamun could breathe, speak, and eat in the afterlife. Offerings of food and drink were placed before shrines. Akhenaten may have been present, draped in mourning linen, her future uncertain even as she watched her husband's passage to eternity. And then the tomb was sealed. Workers rolled stones into place, plastered walls, and painted seals warning of curses on intruders. For Tutankhamun's contemporaries, that was the end. The boy king was gone, his short reign already giving way to the ambitions of Ai and, later, Horemheb. In official king lists, his name would soon vanish. To Egyptians of later generations, it was as if he had never ruled, but fate had other plans. Because the tomb was small, hastily concealed beneath later construction, it escaped the systematic looting that gutted almost every other royal burial. While great pharaohs like Ramses II were reduced to bare sarcophagi, Tutankhamun's chaotic little tomb lay undisturbed. And so, centuries later when Howard Carter's team stumbled upon its sealed doorway, they found not the forgotten footnote of Egyptian history, but the greatest treasure trove of the ancient world. It's one of history's grand ironies. Tutankhamun may have been a minor pharaoh, frail in life and forgotten in death, but the very imperfections of his burial preserved him for immortality. The rush, the improvisation, the cramped tomb, all of it ensured that when the sands of time finally parted, his name would eclipse kings far greater than himself. If the tomb itself seemed modest and hastily prepared, its contents told an entirely different story. Step through the doorway of KV-62 as Howard Carter did in 1922, and your eyes would have widened at the jumble of objects crammed wall-to-wall, chairs toppled on beds, gilded shrines squeezed together, chariots leaning precariously. It was chaos, yes, but chaos shimmering with gold. For a pharaoh whose reign was short and whose burial rushed, Tutankhamun was accompanied into eternity with treasures so dazzling that they remain unmatched in the history of archaeology. The most iconic, of course, is the golden death mask. Resting over his mummified face, it is nearly 24 pounds of solid gold, inlaid with lapis lazuli, quartz, obsidian, and colored glass. Its serene expression gazes forward, lips firm, eyes outlined in deep blue, a cobra and vulture poised on the brow to symbolize rule over Upper and Lower Egypt. Even now, the mask radiates an aura of calm perfection, yet scholars note subtle clues that it may have been repurposed. Its ears pierced like a woman's, the contours suggesting reworking. If true, it underscores the hurried nature of his burial, a masterpiece intended for someone else, adapted for a boy king gone too soon. Beneath the mask lay layers of coffins, each nested like a set of Russian dolls. The innermost coffin, solid gold, embraced his body in warmth that his fragile flesh never knew in life. Outside it, 2 more coffins, gilded wood inlaid with glass and semi-precious stones, formed protective shells. Together they rested within a quartzite sarcophagus, and 4 nested shrines of gilded wood, each one larger and heavier than the last, filling nearly the entire burial chamber. To step inside that room was to enter a golden fortress around a single body. But the treasures were not limited to funerary symbols. The antechamber overflowed with daily objects, meant to serve Tutankhamun in the afterlife. Beds carved with lion, cow, and hippopotamus heads. Folding stools of ivory, boxes painted with hunting scenes. Alabaster jars for perfumes and oils. Chariots leaned against walls, some ceremonial, some functional, with wear suggesting they had been used in life. Weapons lay nearby. Daggers, bows, quivers of arrows, though whether he could wield them is doubtful. Even sandals survived, their soles decorated with images of foreign enemies, so that the king symbolically trampled them with each step. The treasury chamber held ritual objects of power. A great gilded shrine housed canopic jars carved of alabaster, shaped like Tutankhamun's head, containing his embalmed organs. An extraordinary figure of Anubis, the jackal god of embalming, crouched atop a shrine as if guarding the treasures within. Life-size guardian statues flanked the doorway, black-skinned with gold kilts, holding maces and staffs, their eyes gleaming white, sentinels frozen in eternal vigilance. Around them stood boats for sailing in the afterlife, statues of deities, and ritual furniture for ceremonies. Even more personal were the items tucked away, board games like fascinate, walking sticks of various lengths, jewelry inscribed with protective spells, and tiny ivory headrests to cradle his head. There were cosmetics, jars of food and wine, and garments of fine linen folded neatly. Archaeologists found 2 tiny mummies as well, stillborn daughters, swaddled and placed with their father. They testify to the tragedy of a dynasty that failed to produce heirs. One object stands out among the personal items: an iron dagger with a blade forged from a meteorite, at a time when iron was rare and precious. This otherworldly metal symbolized cosmic power. Imagine Tutankhamun holding it, the weight of a star fallen from the sky in his hand. Even in death it rested beside him, a reminder of his celestial connection. The artistry of these objects speaks volumes about Egypt's wealth and craftsmanship. Inlaid thrones gleam with semi-precious stones arranged in meticulous patterns. On one throne, Akhenaten is shown anointing Tutankhamun with oil, a scene intimate and affectionate, captured in gold and lapis. Chests depict him hunting ostriches or battling enemies, their details painted with precision. Alabaster vessels glow with translucence, carved into elegant shapes. To wander among these treasures is to glimpse a civilization at its artistic zenith. Yet there is also a sense of improvisation. Many items seem borrowed from other burials or hastily finished. Names were altered, inscriptions scratched out, and repainted. Some shrines appear oversized for the cramped tomb, shoved in awkwardly. It's as if Egypt's workshops raided storerooms to assemble a royal burial kit on short notice. Still, even leftovers of a pharaoh's treasury outshine anything ordinary Egyptians could dream of. For the ancient Egyptians, these objects were not luxuries, but necessities. A pharaoh required beds to sleep on in the afterlife, food to eat, weapons to defend himself, games to pass the time, and gold to proclaim his eternal status. Every item carried symbolic weight. The sandals with enemies beneath his feet reminded the gods that he ruled over chaos. The golden shrines protected his K from harm. The masks and coffins ensured his body's integrity, essential for resurrection. Imagine the burial procession laying these treasures inside, priests chanting hymns, as gilded shrines were hauled through narrow corridors, workmen straining to maneuver chariots into place, courtiers weeping or pretending to, while statues of gods were positioned to guard the tomb. Finally, the walls plastered, painted with ritual scenes, and the door sealed with a stamp: the necropolis closed forever. Of course, forever turned out to mean until Howard Carter, when the British archaeologist peered through a small hole in the sealed doorway and glimpsed wonderful things by candlelight. He stood at the threshold of a miracle of preservation. Almost every other royal tomb had been plundered in antiquity, stripped of valuables within decades, but Tutankhamun's remained nearly intact, its chaos a time capsule of hurried devotion. To modernize, these treasures made Tutankhamun immortal. The golden mask became a global icon, the very face of ancient Egypt. Museums toured his artifacts around the world, drawing millions. Even people who know little of history recognize his name because of the shimmering wealth buried with him. Ironically, treasures meant to secure his eternity in the afterlife instead secured his fame in this world. And yet, when you look closely, the story those treasures tell is bittersweet. They are dazzling, yes, but also improvised, mismatched, sometimes recycled. They whisper of a pharaoh who died too soon, whose burial was rushed, whose dynasty was faltering. The grandeur is real, but so is the fragility. So picture it one last time. The golden mask resting over the face of a boy who limped through life. The coffins encasing brittle bones. The shrines crowding a chamber never meant for a king. Around him lay treasures beyond imagination, symbols of power he never fully wielded. His death froze that moment, sealing both wealth and weakness in the same space. And 3,000 years later, when the seal was broken, the world would fall in love with the boy king, not for his victories, but for the treasures that told the story he never had time to write. When Tutankhamun's tomb was sealed, Egypt might have hoped the fragile boy king would fade peacefully into the afterlife. But his sudden death left behind a queen, Akhenaten, caught in a storm of desperation and danger. Her story after Tutankhamun's passing is one of the most haunting episodes in all of Egyptian history, not because it ends in glory, but because it vanishes into silence. What little we know comes from scattered fragments, a letter in a Hittite archive, a few inscriptions, and the absence of her name in later records. From those scraps we glimpse the terror of a young widow facing the collapse of her world. Akhenaten was perhaps only 16 or 17 when Tutankhamun died. Already she had endured a childhood of upheaval, born during the Amarna heresy, renamed to fit the Restoration, married to her half-brother, burdened with the pressure to produce heirs. She had miscarried or delivered stillborn daughters, their tiny bodies placed in Tutankhamun's tomb. Now she was a widow without children, the last surviving royal of the Amarna line, in a palace filled with ambitious men. The aging courtier, and Horemheb, the ambitious general. Her position was perilous. It is in this context that the most remarkable letter of the late Bronze Age appears, preserved in the archives of the Hittite king Suppiluliuma. It recounts how a queen of Egypt, Dak, Munzu in the Hittite rendering, almost certainly Akhenaten, wrote, begging for a husband. "My husband has died, and I have no son," she confessed. "They say you have many sons. If you give me one of your sons, he shall become my husband. I will never take one of my subjects as husband." The letter is extraordinary. Egyptian queens did not marry foreigners. Pharaohs did not share power with outsiders. For a queen to ask the Hittite king, Egypt's rival, for a husband was almost unthinkable. The desperation is palpable. Akhenaten feared being forced to marry or Horemheb, powerful men who might use her to legitimize their own claims. By appealing to the Hittites, she gambled on a foreign prince who could protect her position. Suppiluliuma, astonished, suspected a trap, but when her second letter arrived, pleading again, he decided to test it. He sent envoys to confirm the queen's request, and when they returned with assurances, he dispatched his son, Zenanza, to Egypt. The plan unraveled in blood. Zenanza never reached Thebes. Somewhere along the route he was murdered, most likely by Egyptian factions determined to prevent a foreigner from seizing the throne. Scholars debate who ordered the killing. To secure his own rise. Horemheb, to protect Egyptian sovereignty, or perhaps both working in tandem. Whoever struck, the message was clear. No Hittite prince would sit on Egypt's throne. Akhenaten's gamble had failed. After that, her trail goes cold. Some evidence suggests I married her briefly, perhaps to legitimize his rule. In one scene, is shown performing Tutankhamun's funerary rites, a role usually reserved for a son or close relative. That imagery may have been meant to signal his authority through union with Akhenaten, but after this moment she disappears from the record. No monuments, no inscriptions, no tomb. Her name was erased as thoroughly as Tutankhamun's had been from king lists. Whether she died soon after, was quietly exiled, or eliminated by rivals, we cannot say. Her fate embodies the collapse of the Amarna line. With Tutankhamun dead, and no heirs, Akhenaten was the last thread of a dynasty stretching back to Amenhotep III. When she vanished, that thread snapped. Reigned briefly before Horemheb seized power, erasing both their names to restore the dynasty's prestige. In later centuries, Akhenaten's story was forgotten, her desperate plea to the Hittites surviving only in foreign archives. For us, though, her voice still echoes across millennia in that letter. Imagine her, a young woman in the shadowed halls of Thebes, dictating words to scribes with trembling urgency. Her husband dead, her daughters buried, her future hanging in the balance. She reaches beyond Egypt's borders for salvation. Her tone is strikingly personal, almost modern in its vulnerability. I will never take one of my subjects as husband. It is less a queen's command than a young woman's cry for escape. The tragedy is that her plea set off a diplomatic disaster. The murder of Zananza provoked Suppiluliama's wrath. He launched attacks against Egypt's northern vassals, capturing territory, but the campaign backfired when his soldiers brought home a plague, possibly smallpox, that swept through the Hittite Empire, killing the king himself. Thus Akhenaten's letter, born of desperation, may have altered the balance of power in the ancient Near East. A queen's cry in Thebes rippled into the fall of kings in Anatolia. Back in Egypt, however, Akhenaten's memory was obliterated. Horemheb had no interest in preserving the name of a queen tied to both the Amarna heresy and a failed alliance with the Hittites. Her disappearance is one of history's cruel silences. We are left only with fragments. Her name on Tutankhamun's throne, her images beside him in art, her desperate words in a foreign archive. And so, when we think of Tutankhamun's legacy, we must remember Akhenaten too. She was not merely the queen at his side, handing him arrows or adjusting his collar in painted scenes. She was a woman who tried, however desperately, to shape her destiny in a world dominated by men and gods. Her attempt failed, her voice silenced, but her story lingers as a reminder that behind the golden mask and treasures lay human lives, fragile, fearful, and fleeting. Picture her one last time. A young widow standing at the edge of the Nile at dusk, the air thick with the smell of lotus and smoke from temple fires. She stares northward, toward Hatti, imagining a foreign prince riding to save her. Behind her loom the cliffs of Thebes, riddled with tombs, reminders of the fate that awaits all. In that moment she is not just a queen, she is a girl who has lost everything, and is grasping at the faintest chance of survival, and then history swallows her whole. 3,000 years after Akhenaten's voice faded, another voice broke the silence, the shout of a workman in the Valley of the Kings. It was November 1922, and Howard Carter, a determined archaeologist funded by the wealthy Lord Carnarvon, had spent years scouring the valley in search of a tomb everyone else believed did not exist. By then, many scholars thought the valley was exhausted. Dozens of royal tombs had been uncovered, most already robbed in antiquity. Yet, Carter insisted there was one more king unaccounted for, Tutankhamun, a minor pharaoh scarcely mentioned in records, absent from king lists, forgotten by history. The breakthrough came almost by accident. Workmen digging near the entrance of Ramses II's tomb uncovered a set of steps descending into the earth. Carter had them cleared, and by mid-November the sealed doorway of a tomb appeared. On the plaster were faint impressions of seals, some bearing the name Tutankhamun. Carter's heart must have thundered. If this was genuine, he had found what generations of archaeologists had failed to uncover, a royal tomb untouched by thieves. On November 26, 1922, Carter and Carnarvon peered through a small hole made in the doorway. Carter lit a candle, held it up, and gazed into darkness that had been sealed for over 3 millennia. Carnarvon, straining beside him, asked, "Can you see anything?" Carter's reply became immortal. "Yes, wonderful things." Inside, the antechamber was a jumble of treasure, gilded couches, shaped like animals, chariots gleaming with gold, alabaster vessels, boxes piled high. The sight stunned Carter. But this was only the beginning. Beyond, sealed by another doorway, lay the burial chamber itself. When that wall was breached, the true wonder of the find revealed itself. Shrines within shrines, coffins within coffins, and the golden mask that would make Tutankhamun's face known around the world. The excavation was painstaking. Carter spent nearly a decade cataloguing and conserving the more than 5,000 artifacts packed into the tomb. Each item had to be documented, sketched, photographed, and carefully removed. The process turned into a global sensation. Newspapers splashed images of golden thrones, statues, and jewelry across their front pages. Egyptomania gripped the world. Fashion, architecture, and even movie sets drew inspiration from the discovery. Tutankhamun, forgotten for centuries, became the most famous pharaoh overnight. Yet, The discovery also unleashed darker whispers. Within months of opening the tomb, Lord Carnarvon died from an infected mosquito bite. Journalists, hungry for sensation, declared it the curse of the pharaohs. They pointed to inscriptions warning against disturbing the dead, then tied every subsequent death of anyone remotely connected to the excavation to the curse. A cobra ate Carter's canary. A series of untimely deaths among archaeologists and visitors fueled the frenzy. Headlines screamed of supernatural vengeance. In truth, most members of the excavation team lived long, healthy lives. Howard Carter himself survived until 1939, but the legend of the curse became inseparable from Tutankhamun's name, adding mystery to his fame. The global fascination was not just about treasure. The intact tomb offered an unprecedented window into ancient Egyptian life. Every object, from sandals to board games, revealed details of daily existence, religious belief, and royal ceremony. Scholars could study not only the monumental but also the intimate, the jars of food, the linen garments, the personal cosmetics. Tutankhamun's tomb was a time capsule, sealing a moment of Egyptian history with unparalleled clarity. For Egypt, the discovery was both pride and provocation. Nationalists resented the dominance of foreign archaeologists and the export of artifacts. Fierce negotiations led to most of the treasures remaining in Egypt. Housed eventually in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, they became symbols of national identity, golden proof of a heritage that predated and outshone colonial powers. Even today, Tutankhamun's mask remains the centerpiece of Egyptian pride, a reminder that while conquerors came and went, the legacy of the boy king endured. The discovery also reshaped archaeology itself. Before Tutankhamun, tombs were often excavated hastily, with little regard for preservation. Carter's meticulous approach, photographing, recording, conserving, set new standards. The world watched in real time as each object was revealed, creating not just scholarship, but spectacle. Tutankhamun became archaeology's first global celebrity. Yet even amid the treasures, the fragile body of the boy king told a sadder tale. Carter's team, lacking modern conservation techniques, caused damage in handling the mummy. The resin that had charred the body made it brittle, and in removing the coffins, they fractured bones and tore tissue. Early examinations fueled decades of debate. Was he murdered? Was he deformed? Did the curse strike him in life? Each generation of technology, from X-rays to CT scans to DNA analysis, added new pieces to the puzzle, painting the picture of a sickly boy who died suddenly, not a victim of palace intrigue. But to the public, the science mattered less than the spectacle. The mask's golden gaze, the treasure's glitter, the whisper of curses, all combined to turn Tutankhamun into a legend far greater than his reign had ever been. He had ruled only briefly, left no heirs, built no monumental temples, and was almost erased from history. Yet through Carter's candlelit hole, he became the most famous pharaoh of them all. Imagine the scene in 1922. The world emerging from World War I, weary of destruction, hungry for wonder. Into that moment stepped a boy king from 3,000 years earlier, carrying treasures untouched by time for audiences in London, New York, and Cairo. It was as though eternity itself had been cracked open. Tutankhamun, forgotten in antiquity, had risen to conquer modern imagination. And so his legacy shifted. In life, he had been fragile, dependent, almost erased. In death, he became immortal, his face reproduced on posters, coins, even Hollywood films. The golden mask that once shielded his body from decay became the face of ancient Egypt itself. No other king, not Ramses the Great or Thutmose the Conqueror, commands the same universal recognition. Tutankhamun defied death, not through victory or empire, but through the accident of preservation and the drama of rediscovery. The discovery of his tomb also reignited questions of ownership and cultural memory. Who does Tutankhamun belong to? The Egyptian people whose ancestors buried him, or the world that marveled at his treasures? The answer, perhaps, is both. His tomb was sealed for millennia, but when it opened, his story became part of global heritage. Every visitor who gazes into the golden mask becomes a witness to his strange journey from obscurity to immortality. Close your eyes and imagine Carter again at that doorway. The air is musty, thick with the scent of ancient resins. Dust swirls in the candlelight, and beyond, glittering in the shadows, lie objects that had slept untouched since the days when chariots rolled across desert sands. Carter's hands tremble, his eyes widen, and in that instant, Tutankhamun breathes again. Not in flesh, but in the wonder he awakens. That breath has never stopped. Tutankhamun's story did not end with the sealing of his tomb, nor even with its rediscovery by Howard Carter. His true legacy unfolded in the century that followed, as scholars, tourists, artists, and dreamers reimagined the boy king for every new generation. In life, he had been a fragile teenager, overshadowed by advisors and nearly erased from official history. In death, he became the most famous pharaoh who ever lived. His golden face a global icon, that transformation, how a forgotten minor ruler became a symbol of eternal Egypt, is one of the strangest twists of all. The wave of fascination that began in 1922 has never really subsided. When Carter unveiled wonderful things, newspapers plastered his name across front pages, museums staged exhibitions that drew millions, with crowds stretching down city blocks just to glimpse a few treasures. In London in 1972, an exhibition of Tutankhamun's artifacts at the British Museum attracted over 1.6 million visitors. In the United States in the 1970s, the traveling exhibition Treasures of Tutankhamun became a cultural phenomenon, inspiring everything from jewelry lines to disco songs. Egyptomania gripped the modern world, echoing the fascination that Napoleon's soldiers had stirred in the 19th century. Why Tutankhamun, and not the towering figures like Ramses II or Thutmose III? Partly it was timing. The world in the 1920s, scarred by war, was hungry for wonder. And partly it was luck. His tomb, hidden and small, escaped looters, preserving an intact treasury. But deeper still, Tutankhamun resonated because he was human. Unlike Ramses, whose colossal statues proclaim invincibility, Tutankhamun was fragile, mortal, relatable. His treasures dazzled, but his story whispered vulnerability. Youth cut short, dreams unfulfilled, a legacy saved only by accident. That paradox made him irresistible. The so-called curse of the pharaohs also amplified his fame. Though largely myth, it gave journalists a thrilling angle. Lord Carnarvon's death within months of the tomb's opening fueled headlines. Even today, ghost tours and documentaries invoke the curse as if Tutankhamun himself reached across time to punish intruders. The myth sticks because it dramatizes something already uncanny. A boy dead 3 millennia, who somehow commands attention in modern newspapers. Science has only deepened the intrigue. Each new technology has turned Tutankhamun into a patient on the world's longest autopsy table. X-rays in the 1960s, CT scans in 2005, DNA studies in the 2010s, all revealed new layers of his health, ancestry, and death. We now know he was the child of siblings, carried genetic defects, suffered from malaria, and likely died from complications of a broken leg. Far from a striding conqueror, he was a fragile teenager, leaning on canes. And yet, this vulnerability has not diminished him. It has made him more compelling. The golden mask may show serene perfection, but the body beneath it tells the truth of mortality. Tutankhamun bridges God and boy, myth and flesh. His legacy has also shaped Egypt's identity. In the 20th century, as Egypt pushed for independence from colonial rule, Tutankhamun's treasures became powerful symbols of national pride. The golden mask was not just an artifact, it was proof that Egypt's past outshone the empires that sought to dominate it. Even today, his artifacts anchor national museums. Most recently, the Grand Egyptian Museum near Giza, designed with his treasures as a centerpiece. For Egyptians, Tutankhamun is both a reminder of ancient greatness and a rallying cry for modern heritage. Beyond nationalism, his story touches universal themes. He represents the fragility of youth, the mystery of death, the endurance of memory. Artists and writers have woven him into novels, films, and music. Hollywood reimagined him in adventure flicks, sometimes absurdly, but always fascinated. School children around the world learn his name before they know Ramses or Akhenaten. His face, serene and golden, peers from textbooks, posters, and documentaries, a constant reminder of humanity's longing to connect with the ancient past. The legend of Tutankhamun also carries irony. In his own time, he was nearly erased. Later pharaohs omitted him from king lists, his monuments usurped, his name forgotten. He might have remained a footnote, his short reign lost to sand. Instead, his tomb's survival ensured that he became more famous than any pharaoh who tried to erase him. Tutankhamun defied death not by strength or conquest, but by chance. Eternity gave him what life denied. And so, the boy king who once leaned on canes, now stands taller than all others. His mask gleams in museum halls. His treasures inspire awe. His story fuels debate. He is remembered, not for temples or wars, but for the mystery of a life cut short and the miracle of a tomb, untouched. That memory has outlasted empires, religions, and nations. It will likely outlast us too. As we close his story tonight, slow your breathing, and let the desert quiet wash over you. Picture the Valley of the Kings, under a silver moon, cliffs rising like silent guardians, the Nile glimmering in the distance. Beneath the earth, in a small chamber, lies a boy who died young, his frail body wrapped in gold, his name nearly erased. And yet, across time he whispers still, through treasures, through myths, through the gaze of a mask that stares forever forward. You may never walk those painted halls, or touch that golden coffin, but for a moment, as you drift towards sleep, you share the same silence that once surrounded him. Tutankhamun, the boy king who defied death, does not need armies or monuments to endure. He lives in memory, in wonder, in the breathless pause when we glimpse eternity, and realize that even the most fragile life can echo forever. So, rest now. Let the sands cover your thoughts as they once covered the tomb. Let the whisper of the Nile soothe your mind. The boy king sleeps again, and with him, you too can drift into dreams, where gold gleams softly in candlelight, and eternity feels just within reach. The boy who once leaned on canes and bore the burden of crowns has walked with us all the way to the edge of eternity. You've traced his life from a frightened child crowned too soon, through the tug-of-war of advisors and priests, through fragile health and sudden death, into a tomb crammed with treasures and silence. You've watched his queen vanish into shadows, his name erased by successors, and then, thousands of years later, you've stood with Carter at the doorway as a candle revealed wonderful things. Tutankhamun was never meant to be eternal. In his own age, he was a minor figure, forgotten within a generation, a boy who ruled for a blink. And yet, by accident of history, he has outlived them all. His mask gleams in glass cases, his treasures dazzle millions, and his story fills our dreams, fragile in life, immortal in death, the paradox that keeps him close even across 3,000 years. Now, as the desert night settles, let the rhythm slow. Picture the Nile under a blanket of stars, the valley still and hushed, cliffs glowing faintly in moonlight. The tombs lie sealed again, the boy king resting within his golden shell. The world above is noisy, full of questions and arguments, but down there, it is only silence, soft, endless, unbroken. So breathe deeply, let your eyes close, and let that silence reach you. Imagine the golden mask gazing forward, calm and steady, while the sands drift slowly back over the valley. Tutankhamun, the boy who defied death, sleeps on. And tonight, you can sleep beside him in memory, wrapped not in gold, but in peace. Good night. Sweet dreams.